Okay, welcome to Weekend Walkabout, where we take you out into our gardens and yours virtually to look at things that we need to do right now in the garden. This week we're talking about too big, too much, which has to do when you're faced with shrubs that are bigger than you expected to be, perennials that get out of hand and maybe spread too far, all of it happening at a time when there's just too much to do. You're listening to this because we have a business in gardening professionally, call it Garden A to Z, and you'll find our material at gardenatoz.org. We also have gardenatoz.com, which you saw just a moment ago on your screen. We are switching over gradually from .com material from .com to .org, and we can get more into that later. We are able to share this information with you in large part right now, this particular recording, because we are trialing this material. We are looking to see whether or not we can put our material onto video as well as the written form that we've had on our website so far. We've written and illustrated thousands of articles there and are moving into video. But we're new to this and to the medium of recording and sharing it. So you're going to see, for instance, on the side of your screen right now, you will see small images as well as the large image in the center and what might be perhaps a distracting white border. We apologize for that, but we're working through a problem that says that if I show you just the picture on a big screen, we have some issues doing other parts of what we're doing. So please excuse the little tiny pictures along the side. This is copyrighted material. We put an incredible amount, you just wouldn't believe how much time, energy, money, and love that we put into this material. We mean it for your personal use. If you intend to use it for anything other than that, please contact us first. It's very easy to do that off of our website. That's me. I'm Jana Makanovich. My rainbow suspenders mean nothing other than the fact that I like the color. A waiter that was waiting on our table 30 years ago, maybe a little more than that, had them on, and I said, "What great suspenders." He told me where to buy them, and I've been wearing them to hold out my pants, my work pants, ever since. It's my husband, Stephen Nicola. We both work as professional gardeners, which in our case means that we put on our gloves and our work pants and we crawl around in the garden and work in the garden. It's what we prefer to do. We do not anymore have crews that work for us. We prefer to do the work. It's what we love doing, and I hope we'll always be doing. We write and we teach. My background was originally in education, and then I switched over to gardening professionally, and my husband joined in with me. He is a horticultural photographer. He has the degrees in horticulture. We say that he has the degrees and I have the dirty knees. He does almost all of the photographs that we use in our work, although I do some. I do most of the words that we have, although he does some as well. We've written a couple of books together that are still in print available as new books, Designing Our Gardens and Landscapes and Caring for Perennials. We have a number of others. And for years we wrote and still write, but we write in different places. We wrote for the Detroit News and Free Press, a column called Growing Concerns, and for 10 years in the Michigan Gardener. The column in the Detroit News was written as a question and answer column, and to a large extent the Michigan Gardener magazine worked the same way. But what we found in working this way is that we got an incredible number of questions and situations presented to ourselves. We logged about 11,000 questions in 13 years. And in those questions, we were able to put a couple a week into the newspaper, but the rest of them, we answered or looked into all of them. It was an incredibly wonderful, humbling, and privileged experience to be in and out of that many people's gardens, to garner that much more experience than we would have ourselves. And at that point, we decided that what we need to do is we need to capture these things that we are writing about and put them someplace so that we can continue writing about new things and share this stuff with other people. And that's what we do. So as professionals working in and out of other people's gardeners and with the background of talking to so many people about the problems that they run into, we understand when you go out in the spring and you are overwhelmed. This is our garden of 38, almost 39 years at the house that we left 3 years ago. You probably will see more of that as you attend weekend walkabouts with us. But we understand that you can go out and say, I have no clue where to start. this was insanity, and actually, as an aside, insanity for a professional gardener to do this kind of thing, because there's very little time to take care of your own garden. But we loved our gardens and we wanted more. And over the years, we just kept taking out more lawn and putting in more gardens until this is what they look like. And it's why we tell people, start very early. Our records for working with gardens, if gardens for other people, and our experience in working on our own gardens is that if you start early in late winter and very early spring, when the plants can't talk back, when they can't defend themselves so well, when you aren't worried about rattling this one's stems or destroying this one's bloom period or upsetting the beautiful look that two plants have leaning on each other, this is the time of year when you can get most productive. Now you wait for the snow to melt, but it is when you can get most productive. And we work for people who are as crazy, insane as we are, but we are able to be there to take care of them. So this is just as crazy a garden as what you just saw. The difference is that a gardener is there every couple of weeks to trim things back, to keep things separated, and to do the best by the plants that are there. Back in the corner, that is a tree. It is it is a Franklinia tree. There we are. It is in bloom. Yeah, it blooms in the late summer, and the way that we handle it, it blooms in early fall in September. That is a tree, but it doesn't look like a tree. We need to keep it cut so that my client can still see out the window, and so we keep it cut. And this is a tree that when we started looking at it and realizing that it was blooming on new wood, we said, well, we can keep this cut. And so we'll put this in where you can see it and enjoy it late in the year. We were at a conference, my husband, Steve Nicola, and I, for the Pennsylvania Master Gardeners, and sitting at a table with two of the other speakers at the conference who were horticulturists from Longwood Gardens. If you haven't been to Longwood Gardens in Pennsylvania, you really need to go. It is one of the premier gardens of the world, just an incredible place, staffed by people who are just amazing in the amount of experience and the types of experience that they have. So we were sitting with these two, and we heard them talking about the Franklinia registry. This is a tree that's native in North America, but probably extinct in the wild. It was heavily gathered by the late 1700s, early 1800s plant explorers like the Bartram brothers, and sent as an ornamental plant to many other places. So it probably doesn't exist in the wild anymore. And someone has created a registry for where these trees are, how they are doing, how they are growing. And the horticulturists at Longwood were talking about that and about their Franklinia on the registry. And wanting to include us in the conversation, they asked us, well, you're in Michigan, can you grow Franklinia? We said, well, yes, actually, we can. We do have to keep it in sheltered places, but it does grow for us in zone 6 for sure, and in sheltered places of zone 5. Oh, they said, that's pretty neat. How big do they get for you? I said, well, we can't really tell you how big they get because we only have a couple, and we keep them cut back. And there was this silence, and they looked at us scandalized that someone who had a Franklinia would chop it up every year. But the silence lasted for about a half a minute, and then they looked at each other and looked back at us and said, so when do you cut it? Because that's what gardeners are about. Gardeners are all about learning how you do what you do with a plant and finding out that not everything is done the same way in every garden, and it's not wrong no matter how anybody does it. Gardens are very personal things. This is the flower on the Franklinia. They are gorgeous, and quite often they are still blooming with these creamy white flowers when the leaves turn a wonderful, wonderful maroon getting into the fall. So anyway, I do understand taking care of crazy gardens, and our own garden is crazy too. These are the sticks that we've taken out of things in our yard, and quite often others. We drag things home from other people's places, and we stack up and pile here. We've got re-rod jammed in the ground to make ourselves a crib for our branches, and we put them in there and accumulate them over time. So because we're crazy gardeners, and because we garden professionally for crazy gardeners, we have for 40 years been pruning just about everything, just about every way that you can prune it, because it is a personal thing, and we're doing our gardening for various people. You have, or you can have, by going to our website, gardenatoz.org, and looking at About Us, and where underneath About Us, you'll find where we're appearing, and under there, webinar materials to download. You could download this material. This is the outline that I'm going to be following today, and that we write up to help our clients remember some of the important points that we're talking about, and also today, right now, to keep me on track so that I know what I'm supposed to be talking about first and second and third. So as I go along, I'll be indicating to you where we are in the presentation, and you'll be able to go and make your notes in the margins or look back at that in a quick recap of what you saw here without having to listen back through the whole thing. So I'm going to start with our first advice to you for this time of year when you're going out, which is to tune in. Try to remember last year. It's very difficult for gardeners to remember last year. We have this tendency to look at what's going on right now in the garden and forget completely how big something was last year, which plants it was in the perennial garden that were out of control. So think hard about it. We take pictures, and that helps us quite a bit to look what's going on, and are able to tell people, look, I know that you're nervous about how I am cutting your plant, but remember, here's what your pyramidal U looked like in 2012. Here's what it looked like in 2015. We brought it down, we made it fluffy. You can decide for yourself, do you like that one better or do you like this one better? If you like this one better, then bear with me and put up with what it's going to look like. This particular client, when we told them that it would cost quite a bit of money, probably about $100 just for the new plant to replace that worn out one, I said, let us prune it. We can rejuvenate it for you, and you can just kind of look the other way while it comes back into its own. And that's pretty much what we do. So moving on from focus, try to remember last year so that you know you're working on the things that are most important. Then remember that there's no one way that's right to prune anything in the garden. And this has caused a lot of confusion in gardening ranks everywhere. Anybody we've ever talked to has said, but what about the rule about not pruning this part of the plant or pruning at this time of the year? That whole bunch of conflicting information is there because the things you do, the techniques that you use to prune, are going to vary based on what your result is, what your objective is, and also what your resources are. We've talked to a lot of professional gardeners in public gardens, for instance, who say, yeah, I know that's the right time to do it, but we don't have the manpower to be able to do everything at the right time, so we do it when the heck we can do it. And the perfect example of objectives would be, for instance, a forester, someone who is managing a property in order to take lumber off of the property every 20 years or so. And it's important there to have the right kinds of trees, but also to keep those trees in a condition that they produce good board lumber. If it's good lumber, then you are able to find a lumbering company to take the wood off the property for you and keep the forest young that way. If you don't have good wood, you're not going to be able to find a lumbering company. That, from forestry, from growing plants for lumber, comes the advice that you should never head back a plant. You should never cut back that part of the plant that we call the leader or the end tip of the branch. That part has no division between itself and the whole rest of the trunk or the whole rest of that main branch. It is the main trunk. It is the main branch. And unlike a side branch, it doesn't have a group of cells at its base that say, here I was a different plant at one point, and a place where the plant can compartmentalize damage. So if I cut a leader back, which means that I head back or cut that part off, a section of the wood inside, of the central rings inside, as big around in diameter as where I made the cut, that area, all through the whole rest of the trunk or main branch, all the way down to the point where the branch ended, or all the way down to the roots, a a column that size fills up with resin and becomes a knot. So now that I've headed the tree back, I have a knot that goes clear through all of the wood, and that's not good for lumber. Thus, we get the advice, don't head back. And yet there are plants in Europe, we've seen them in the Netherlands and Germany and France and England and all over, and in a number of places in America where things have been headed back regularly for 100 years, 200 years, in some of the older places in Europe, 300 years. And it doesn't kill the plant. It just means that that plant would not make good lumber if they were ever to cut it down and use it for lumber. So not only does you get a lot of confusion because people think that rules apply to everybody when really they're only applying to the situation where the person made the rule, but also in different locations, the plant might grow or respond differently. We've heard people in England tell us, well, this is an excellent time now in November to prune your yews. It's a lot colder in the winter in Michigan here, and if I'm going to prune a yew quite hard, I'm probably not going to do it in November because so much of the interior wood will be exposed to more cold than it was ready to handle. So it's just the plants respond differently in different places, and we make our different rules that way. So when you are deciding what to do and what to prune on your own, we say decide your objective or your why you're pruning from 4 reasons to prune. We say there are only 4. And if you think about what it is that you are pruning for, you'll be able to figure it out. The 4 reasons to prune are to keep the size small, to restrict the size, to improve the shape, to promote vigorous growth, or to remove the stuff that's dead or diseased or dangerous that might fall into or onto something. And because restricting size is the most productive at this season of the year, we're going to be talking a lot about restricting size right now. It's, in fact, all year long, it's the number one reason that gardeners prune, that you go out there and start pruning. There's a lot of reasons that it's the main reason that people prune. The most consistent one that we can find is that books, plant tags, information even from growers is vague or misleading. You might read that something is a small tree and not really think the same idea for small that someone else thought of for small. Sometimes they're just downright misleading. As my husband says, you're never going to find a tag at the nursery that says that a shrub is more than 10 feet tall. It's scary to people to think about shrubs being that big. But many shrubs are bigger than 10 feet. In fact, the technical definition of a shrub is a plant up to 20 feet that grows on multiple trunks and it's woody. And there's a fine line there between trees and shrubs. So sometimes people just were misled by a tag or what they read in a book. Other times people misunderstand what dwarf means, for instance. They say, well, they said it was a dwarf. And this happens all over the world. People say, well, they said it was a dwarf. And dwarf only means that it's smaller in some fashion than the parent species. It doesn't mean that it's little like Dopey and Grumpy and Sneezy and all the rest of those Snow White dwarfs. And then there are people who just can't visualize when someone says that it's going to be 15 feet tall. They figure, well, that's all right, 15 feet, not really thinking about the fact that 15 feet is all the way up to the roof of your house, and maybe that's bigger than you want it. So people end up with plants that they then really like a lot and don't want to get rid of that are just way too big for the place where they put them. So it's the number one reason we prune. And in order to prune to restrict size, it's really important that you learn to read plant growth, because almost any plant can be kept small, which is a good thing. But how much it grows each year determines how difficult it is to keep it small and how much work it is to keep it small. And then some species look better when they're pruned heavily than other species do. So you need to be able to understand growth rate, and growth rate, which we'll go through in some of our planting examples, is simply how much the plant tends to grow per year, so that you can say, I want to cut you back once a year. I'm going to cut you back by how much you grow in a year. Here's our first example. This is a boxwood plant at one of our clients' gardens. It's a pyramidal boxwood called Green Mountain, and it is it's a garden where we keep things informally shaped. So we try to shape them roughly the size of the shape that the plant would take on its own, but not a tightly clipped, sheared look. And we cut them once every 2 years, not only because we like the look that way, but also because it's less work and we try to cut work down for clients. So on the left, you see the plant in right after we've given it its every 2-year cut. It's in August. We're going to be able to prune like this right now in early spring, but there is another window to prune, which is later in the year, and that's when these particular plants are scheduled on our calendar. So we just cut it. You can see that there are kind of gaps in the foliage where I've thinned it out, but that's how it looked in 2012. The next year, so a year later, that's what it looked like. You can see that here and there are some ends sticking out, but no wild growth, no craziness going on there. And we'll clean up those little tips, but we won't prune it again until 2014 in August, at which point it will look pretty much like you're looking at it there. And that's what we want. We want it to be something that doesn't have to be done all the time. I'm sure that some of you have been out and pruned and had what we call antenna come sticking out of the plant. It seems like you no sooner put away your shears or your clippers and go inside and have a cup of coffee when you look out the window and there's something sticking out of the plant. We try to avoid that, and this time of year is really good for avoiding that. As another of our examples, this is a leatherleaf viburnum, and where the boxwood was growing about 6 inches a year, this leatherleaf viburnum can easily grow 3 to 4 feet a year. And yet we've got it in a place in the garden where we want to keep it small, where it feels like a privacy screen behind you when you sit in the chair, not like there is a looming giant behind you. So that plant, because it grows that much, and because we like to have that plant in the yard, and so we will grow that plant in the yard, we cut it twice a year in order to keep that growth rate down. If you look into the plant here at the base, this lighter brown, warmer brown cane right here is a 1-year cane. If you follow it up, you'll find it straight all the way up to here where it branches. So that's all 1 year's growth. And what happens when we prune it twice is we take canes out down at the bottom. We literally remove entire canes on a regular basis. And then after it's grown and bloomed for that year, we take the new canes that have grown and we cut them back so that they branch without continuing to go upward and getting even bigger than we want them to be. This is that same species, leatherleaf viburnum, at a different client's house, one where they want to keep them quite little. And the technique that our client Catherine has been using there is to just cut the tops back. And that's been happening for, over 10 years on this plant. And one day while I was visiting, just looking at what was going on in the garden, Catherine mentioned to me that she doesn't like how they look anymore. And I looked at him and said, well, if you would let me prune them for you this time, Catherine, what's been happening is you've been cutting all at the top. And so all of the branching is happening at the top. It's the only place that the plant has enough light to make it worth its while to grow and branch out from new buds every time you cut. I need to also do that other thinning, which is to thin it out. So I took this plant and did that to it. Now, if you look at the plant before and look at it after, looking at the before picture, I think I'm doing this unnecessarily. I think I have them side by side here. There we go. If you look at the before picture on the left, can probably see at least two places where there are two trunks growing right next to each other. Here's one here, two trunks, and here's another, two trunks growing right up together. There's no good reason for those for the plant to have those two trunks right next to each other. They're both trying to occupy the same space and can only make branches that would occupy the same space. So one of the things that I do when I'm cutting out from the very bottom is I take out those canes that are double. So it's gone and it's gone. I take those out first and then cut back the remainder of the branch. So I clip them back so I don't have many small branches, but have fewer good-sized branches. Now, I'm going to need to come back through and nip the tops when that starts growing like crazy later in the year, but we'll be able to keep more foliage down in this part of the plant because the new growth coming up and the young growth that came up and was able to come up last year, you see one right here, and one right here, we'll be able to get more robust and get more leaves down in this part. You won't just have that hollow ball effect of all the leaves up at the top. So it's much more difficult to keep that leatherleaf viburnum, such a big plant, so small, than it is to keep a boxwood small. And the difference between them is the growth rate, and that's what's making it difficult for you. There's those leatherleaf viburnums behind the chair. This is after they've bloomed. They've been thinned for the year, and now they're taken off for the sky and beginning to give you that feeling that there is someone breathing on your back when you sit in the chair. And here they are right after I've done the pruning this is about late June at this point. You have to look to see that, yes, they are shorter. The picture's taken from pretty much the same place, and you can see on the right-hand after picture much more of the arborvitae hedge that runs behind that area. If you look here, right there, there is one tip that's still right there, still in the same place. So it's brought the overall height down, but it has left the plant looking still a little bit soft on the edges and having new tips on the edges. Looking at it from this angle, you can probably see a little bit better how much more of the hedge in the back you can see than you could in the left-hand picture, which was taken before the pruning. And that's what I was taking out. Whole branches down at the bottom, as well as shortening the new stuff that came up. Now, I need to say that as we're looking here, and because we've been told by a lot of the people that we've taught in classes or who have attended presentations we've done over the years, those people have said your pictures are just exactly what we need for the befores and the afters. No, these are not in our book. We've become a little discouraged with our publisher, with publishers in general. Of the bigger publishing companies have become more and more, fewer and fewer as they consolidate. One buys another, for instance, in the case of our publishing company. And then what they want to publish is something that is applicable to the entire country. And we don't feel that the entire country can be addressed in one book. Gardening is and always is going to be a regional affair. So we can talk to people in the area we work, which is the Great Lakes region. Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Michigan. We have clients in Ohio and in New York. And in Massachusetts, we can do New England, but not the entire country. So these pictures are not necessarily in our book. And many of these pictures are not necessarily book grade photographs. Not book grade as publishers would mostly expect them to be. These pictures were taken while I was working for my client. And in this case, they're pictures that Janet took, not Steve the professional. Janet just took her little pocket camera out of the flat pocket in her work pants and took the pictures so that we would have it in case we needed it. So sometimes we're going to be able to show you pictures that are from the same angle, before and after, and other times it's going to be a little bit less so. But then if we didn't have these kinds of pictures and these issues, we probably wouldn't be here online talking to you. because no publisher publishes this many pictures or publishes pictures that are not perfect. They would say to us on our book, Caring for Perennials, they said, that's a good thing. Can we take that picture over again? And we'd say, no, we can't take it over again. It happened once, and that's exactly how it worked. All right, so the nice thing about this pruning that most of us do most of the time, which is to keep things small, is that it has the easiest directions of any of the kind of pruning. And the directions are written for you on the page that you can download that has the outline of this presentation. It's there under Roman numeral 3 point B and C. You can keep almost anything small, and it's growth rate that makes the difference. And how you do that pruning is 1, 2, 3 under C. You let the plant grow to the size that you desire it to be, height and width. And then you prune once a year to remove everything that grew beyond that limit. Or maybe you cut every 2 years and you cut it back by 2 years. But if you learn to distinguish the current wood from the old wood, you'll be able to figure that out and set your own timing on your pruning. After you prune to remove everything that's outside your desired height and width, you also must cut some branches back further than that to keep new growth coming. Pardon my rough sketches here, but here's what you have. Just planted, you put it in the ground, and then you decide how big you want it to be. Like Catherine, you might say it's got to be below the windowsill, or like Betty, you might say it can be behind my chair and make me feel private. You make that decision, and you, at that point, after you set that limit, you let the plant grow. And in this case, it's a new plant, and a year later, it's still under your radar. It's still small enough. So you can say, I don't have to do anything to you. But once it reaches your limit in that year, what you need to do is cut back everything that grew beyond the line. And we cut back by 1 year below the line so that it can grow a year before it gets back up to that line again. And most importantly, we also take some branches out of the interior, cut back into the interior to keep growth coming in here. New, lively, foliage-filled, flower-filled, berry-filled foliage as well. And here's a tree, so we can show you the example. A tree, most people would say, well, it's a bush. This is a Hinoki false cypress. Hinoki is also called the Japanese garden cypress. The tree itself, Chamaecyparis obtusa, is a very large tree, large enough that you use the trunk of the tree to hold up the center of a temple. This one is a dwarf variety, Chamaecyparis obtusa, gracilis, and it will probably get to be 15 feet tall, maybe a little bigger than that, but we're not going to find that out. We like it to be about 5 feet tall, about the gardener's easy reach to the top of the plant, and we cut it every 2 years. So the first thing I do is I take the top back. I cut the leader. I commit that crime of heading back the plant. So I cut into the leader and I cut the side branches that were reaching up beyond my top limit. I cut them back too, and I cut both the leader and side branches back by 2 years. When I get done, I've also cut the sides back by 2 years. So if you look at before and after, you'll see that the top has been cut back by, this plant grows about 6 inches a year, and so we've cut it back a foot. It's about a foot shorter here, but so are the branches up near the top. This has been cut back, and it wasn't cut back just in an even line right to the side of the plant here. Excuse me while I switch hands and move my mouse around here. I'm using the wrong hand to mouse my cursor around with. There we go. So we haven't sheared it. That branch has been cut not only back 6 to 12 inches, but back to a side branch so that there's still that feathery, irregular look that we love in the false cypress. We like them because we think they look kind of like a coral reef. So all the way down the plant here, for instance, that's gone and clipped back into the interior. And what we took off So here is one of the branches that we took off. We took off those branches to bring it back 2 years growth, which is 12 inches. But the branch we took off is longer than 12 inches because we need to cut back to a side branch that gives us a tip that comes out here. So for instance, if we cut that branch back here, which would be to take about 10, 11 inches off the end of the branch, the side branches that are left are still coming up this far on the plant. It would be as if we cut the plant back to here. In order to cut it back the whole 2 years, we're reaching back further into the plant to leave a side branch. So what's left on the plant now, still growing, came up to here, and that's where we want them to end. So each of these, this already is a branch. This is a branch too. It's just a young branch. The needles, the leaves on a false cypress are those little tiny segments there. That makes this a branch. So there's lots of branches back here, and we can cut to any branch that comes from that. We can cut to just above any branch there, and that one will take off and become a new branch. These are some of the sides that we've taken off, showing you what happens over time. This crook in the branch here, this crook right here, are where we cut it back once before, and that side branch took off and became the new leader, the new tip of the branch. And now we're cutting it again, because that's what we keep doing, is we just keep cutting these plants. There's that crook right there. And the new growth on this plant, you can tell by the color of the bark. So the first year that it grows, it has kind of a honey brown color to it. Then as it gets older, it starts developing bark that's more toward a warm brown. And then further back in the plant, bark that's even darker. So we can look and say, here's how much you're growing, about 6 inches a year, about the length of our pruning shears. So that's employing those 3 of the simplest steps that you can. Cut back everything to your limits, height and width, and then also take back inside the plant. This is a larger Chamaecyparis obtusa gracilis that we let grow bigger because the space that it has is bigger. We let it grow for 2 years and then we cut it back. We let it grow for 2 years and then we cut it back. And the size that we want it to be is just over the gutter. So when it's cut back, and this is just cut back in the late summer, actually early fall in this case, it's just reaching the gutter. It will grow 6 inches next year and 6 inches before that. And then we'll come along and cut it again. We haven't hurt it and it's not dying. It's just late enough in the growing season in the fall that these are the older needles, older leaves on this fall cypress going into fall color and beginning to fall. I do the same thing to bird's nest spruce, which is not a pointed top plant like those others are, but a rounded plant. It's a dwarf. It is a plant that's a dwarf of the Norway spruce. Norway spruce can grow to 100 feet easily. But this dwarf, a lot of people like to prune as we have planted it here as a foundation planting because, excuse me, I'm going to take a moment here and cough. I have been talking too much the last few days. It's a little rough on my voice. So that bird's nest spruce, which is a dwarf, will definitely live up to its name of being a dwarf. It probably won't get more than about 3-4 feet tall, but it can get to be 15 or 20 feet wide, which is not acceptable in this space. So every 2 years, I come through and clip what's gone beyond my line, which is the edge of the walkway here. I'm going to take each branch that has reached the edge of the line. I'm going to hold the tip of that branch and reach back into the plant to cut out that branch back to a side branch whose ends are within my line. The growth rate on this little puppy is only about 3 and 4 inches a year. Sorry, let's get this back on track here. Go. So our growth rate is new growth, this light colored wood up here. That's our new growth for the year. And this happened to be a good year when it had 2 pushes of growth. So we're getting about 4 inches of growth a year, which means I need to cut it back 8 inches. But if I cut it back just 8 inches, this side branch is already beyond that point. So I've cut it all the way back to here, to where a side branch ended at roughly this place here. And again, you can see the place where it was cut once before. See that cut. So if I cut there, it would not reduce the plant by 2 years, and that's my goal here. So I'm reaching well back into the plant in order to cut back here to a side branch. That lets me keep that nice fluffy shape, that look that you saw in the picture up above. That plant's 15 years old at this point. I think about 15 years old. And still within our limits and still looking like we like that plant to look, with that nice irregular layered feathered edge. And we have the added benefit, those of us who prune this way, where we prune once a year or once every 2 years and let the plant grow, is that when we get a new push of growth, which is so beautiful in the evergreens, we don't come along and cut it off right away. We get to enjoy all of that wonderful color, and it is a very significant color you can add to your garden to have the new growth coming out on those. Now, going into timing when it comes to restricting growth, anytime that you want to cut something to restrict growth, go ahead and do it. But there are some best times to do it. It's best when the season's growth is all set for the year. So between mid-August, when the growth is done for the year, and when it breaks bud the next spring, at that point, the season's growth is all set, and you're going to get the best response for the plant, the longest lasting response, if you prune at that time. We generally avoid the times when it's growing most strongly. So in spring, when the new growth is pushing out, or in autumn when the leaves are dropping. For a lot of us, we don't think of that as a strong growth, but in autumn, the roots are growing like crazy. We try to avoid those areas, and we always avoid wet weather. We'll get into that a little bit later. So I'm out a lot in the wintertime in a thaw. This might not look like a thaw, but it is a thaw. If the weather is mild, at or about freezing, above freezing during the day, and the temperature doesn't drop very much at night. So maybe it's 20, 27, 28 at night, and it goes up to 35, 36 during the day. That's a wonderful thaw to prune at. And we do that pruning at a time when it's going to be a thaw for 2 or 3 days so that the plant can acclimate to the new conditions when we cut all the wood out. And that's what I'm cutting out of some of the shrubs at our older house. But we're not going to talk about dormant pruning, winter pruning right now. We're going to talk about right now in late spring. Now, back to what the rules are and why people cut when they cut. We cut this blue mist spirea, or bluebeard. It's a caryopteris. And every year we cut that all the way to the ground. We talked about that in a previous webinar and what we do. We cut it all the way down. I mean, right down to the ground. You can walk on top of it when we're done with it. And we do that every year. We could do that in the fall or in the winter. We don't. We wait until now, bud break, because we really like the way that it looks in the winter, holding the seed pods from the year before, the color that it is, the fill that it gives us in that part of the garden. So you make your rules based on what you're doing with your plants. This is a Japanese maple that we've kept this size for about 20 years now. It got to this size, and we said, that's as big as you can get. You can't go blocking the walkway, and we don't want you to get bigger than that. So we cut it back, and we generally cut it back during winter thaw. This happens to be a year when the plant did not lose all of its leaves in the fall. That happens sometimes to Japanese maples. They get caught in the fall when the temperature changes suddenly and the leaves do not fall all the way. We'll get into that in some other webinar about why that happens. But the fact that it happened here meant that it's a little bit easier for you to see in the before picture on the left and the after picture on the right that we took out not just from the outer edge of the plant. We didn't just shear at the height and width limits. We went into the plant and took stuff out from the middle too. And that makes the healthiest and most natural look on a plant. Now, if flowers are important to you, then you modify the pruning schedule in order to do the best by your flowers. And that's where the rule that people have often heard, if it blooms in the spring, cut it in the summer. If it blooms in the summer, cut it in the spring or fall. And that's roughly for us about the middle of June. If it blooms before the middle of June, then any hard pruning that I do to it is removing wood that was going to bloom. And I wait on that plant. If I want to have maximum bloom, I wait until after it blooms, and then I prune it. And those that flower after June 15th are blooming on new wood, so I can cut them however I want, and all of the wood that grows is generally going to be old enough to bloom. It's general timing. So looking at that applied to keeping a dwarf lilac small, we're going to look at this Miss Kim lilac, Syringa pelobiniana Miss Kim. There are some others that are called the dwarf lilacs. It wants to be about 6-8 feet tall, which is dwarf for a lilac. But in this case, we want it to stay below the windowsill. So every year we cut it, and we cut it like I showed you with the viburnum. We're going to cut it twice a year, but most of the cutting we do right after it blooms. And what you see on the lawn in front is everything I just cut out of that plant. It's a lot of cutting for a plant that wants to be big. So it looked like this, and it bloomed. And this is the year after the cut you just saw. So the inset picture in the top right is this year, the year that we're doing the cutting. The picture behind is the year after that cutting. See, it comes up, it blooms, and it blooms at the windowsill level. Then after it has finished blooming and the flowers no longer have the appearance that make us say, oh, that's such a pretty plant, then we do the pruning, which is to bring it back to about 6 bricks below the window is our growth rate for that plant. Bring it back to that level and also thin the inside. So you're seeing all that's been taken out there on the lawn to the right. Now what we're cutting out is branches all the way back to the ground most of the time because we're keeping this lilac so little. Here's the growth rate. See the new colored wood, that light colored wood? It's growing about 12 inches a year, about 6 bricks. So I know I have to cut it so that it is 12 inches below the brick and will be up and blooming at brick level. And shortly after we prune it in the summer, it'll be back up to that level, readying itself to bloom there the next year. But I can't just shear it on the outside or I'd end up with that hollow ball look like the viburnum at Catherine's. So I go all the way into the bottom of the plant to take canes out all the way down to the ground. So when I'm pruning this one that has to be cut back that far, I'm taking out the oldest stems. The bark on the older stem has begun to get lenticels, visible lenticels, these little bumps on it, versus smoother back here. I'm going to take that one right out. I'm going to take the one that I'm holding in my hand that's thicker down here, all the way out down to the bottom. And I'm also going to take out spindly little teeny tiny wood because we don't need that much wood. It's a big plant we're keeping small. So that's what I'm cutting out as I cut it out. There it is, it's finished blooming, and I cut it again. Now, what you're looking at right now, see that there's not much difference in the height because I'm doing something that I'm going to tell you to do, and that's not in the books. And is one of the reasons, telling you this is one of the reasons that we have our website and are doing these kinds of recordings, is that although I tell you to cut the plant back to the limits that you leave it, 6 bricks below the window and less wide, and then thin it, that in reality, once you get to doing this, you will find that if you do it that way, shear it, cut indiscriminately to your limit, and then thin it, you're cutting some branches twice. And once you see that, you'll say, well, I'm not going to cut that branch twice, and I know what I'm doing, so I can thin first. And that's what's going on here. I have thinned first, and then cut it back. Now, if you think, oh, that looks thin, remember, it's going to fill out in 2 weeks' time. It's going to fluff out, and you won't notice that there's any thinness at all. And you reap a plant that will stay in your limits. If you don't do that thinning, you get this look. Now, this isn't a dwarf lilac. It's a burning bush. Poor baby. Burning bushes are such beautiful, artistically branched trees, but not when someone repeatedly cuts them and cuts them, sometimes 2 and 3 times a year, right up at the same limit, repeatedly taking just a few inches off. So we get lots of stuff here. I'm getting a question from Barb asking about how would I cut that. In this case, I would, if you want it to stay about where it appears they're cutting it to, see, just up to the window, so that if they're standing at the window looking out up here, they can see over the plant. If I want it to be there, knowing that burning bush, this is a dwarf burning bush, ultimately about 10 feet tall, but they want it to be 5 feet tall. I'm going to cut it by about a year, which would be its growth rate for a year, if somebody left it alone. I'm going to cut it off at this level. And then I'm going to cut some of these bigger branches out further down. And because it's burning bush at 5 feet, not dwarf lilac, trying to keep it at 3 feet, we're not trying to keep it as small proportionally as it could be, I'm not going to have to cut all the way to the ground. I'm going to take a branch like this one right here. It's growing up into the same area that this branch and this branch are in. I'm going to cut a few branches all the way back every year. Here's another one right here, growing up into the same area as others. I'm going to use a saw or loppers and cut that off further. So shear and then thin. So here's the dwarf lilac when we took it over. When the people that we are gardening for moved into the house, it looked like the picture on the left. Basically, the lilac version of that burning bush you just saw. And we didn't consider that attractive, nor did we consider it worth the effort to be having to cut that repeatedly up at that level. And it wasn't blooming as well as it would. So you make your decision. Do you like it better on the right than on the left? Then the simple pruning is to every year prune it heavily after it finishes blooming and take wood out all the way into the interior after you clip it back. Now we have to be tougher than that on this forsythia. This forsythia is at Mildred's house, and Mildred is fond of forsythia, very fond of forsythia, but has a little garden. It's only probably about 4 feet wide out from the house at this point, and that's much smaller than a forsythia wants to get. Those of you who have forsythia growing in your backyard where you can let them grow unchecked know that they get to be easily 8-10 feet tall and wide. So what we do for this one is right after it blooms every year, I cut it back. Sometimes I cut it all the way to the ground, sometimes I cut it like this, but we cut the living daylights out of it and let it grow back. Whoops, excuse me. So it does this. So the progression is top left. You see it is after that picture you just saw here, it is growing back. And then in July of that year, grown back. And right then it's about as big as we can let it to be. You can see it from that picture that there's actually 2 of these forsythia next to each other. Then it blooms, and then I chop it back. And then the next year I cut it back, it grows back, grows taller. And that particular year, by June or July, it was growing on the crazy side. And like the viburnum I showed you originally, I had to cut some of those branches back a little bit so that the neighbor's car wouldn't run into them. And then when it got ready to bloom, it's like this. Here's another example of the effect, that the consequence of our being professional gardeners and taking pictures as we actually do the work, is that we can't set these up to look exactly the same all the time. And I can't necessarily be there when the plant's in full bloom. I'm in other people's gardens, so this picture is right after it finished blooming the next year, so I can't show it to you in its full glory. In doing this, and really any kind of pruning, it's critical that you know about apical dominance. Apical dominance doesn't mean ape like the great apes. It means apex, tip, that the growth at the tip of the branch is going to create chemicals that control the growth of every tip and every bud lower or closer to the inside of the plant than it is. This one is dominant, and it will then be able to grow 12 inches on this burning bush in a year, whereas this branch that's the next tip down will only grow 8 inches, and the groups that are next tip down will grow 4 inches. That's all happening because that bud at the tip is dominant, is creating chemicals that tell the other things what to do. And in that tip bud, there's not just a couple of leaves. The entire shoot for the year, the shoot, all of the leaves along the side of the shoot, even the flower at the top of the plant on a spring bloomer is all there and ready to push out. If I cut that tip bud when it is finished for the year, that's after about the middle of August for us here in the Great Lakes, up until it starts to open the next spring, during that period, that tip bud is done growing for the year, and every bud behind it has set its chemicals based on the leader, based on what it told it to do. So if I take that bud off before it opens, after it's set and before it opens, all of the rest of the buds remain in order in terms of how much they're going to grow. You don't get that wild antenna whip look because all the other buds still think chemically that tip bud is still there, and they grow in a more orderly fashion. So by knowing about the tip bud, I know that if I cut it, I get a more orderly growth. I also know that whichever bud I leave after the cut that is furthest out from the base and furthest up on the plant, that bud will become dominant. And if that bud is facing in a direction I want the growth to continue this way, then that's ideal. So when I cut, I'm cutting to a bud that's going to take over in the direction that I want it to grow, not growing backwards into the plant or off to the dark side here. And when you cut the tip bud back, these dormant buds, these little buds along the branch on the burning bush, and they're under the bark on every other kind of plant, these dormant buds had been told not to grow the next year. With the bud gone, sometime during the growing season, not right away, but sometime during the growing season, these are going to be released to grow, and they'll give you fill inside the plant. So our examples here are, you've seen the lilac already, or clematis. Someone asked specifically after the last webinar, tell us about clematis pruning, and we started to assemble pictures to show you about that and realized that we already have that particular set of pictures. That's probably the best pictures you are ever going to see on how to prune a clematis are in our issue 511 on gardenatozee.com. We won't get into it right now, but we have and have published on gardenatozee.com. Currently, we're publishing on gardenatozee.org, but we're straddling both of them because our material, thousands and thousands of pages of articles are in both places. So if you went to gardenatozee.com and in our search field up here, typed in clematis pruning, or if you want to do 511, it would take you to this article. And what you're looking at with a clematis is you're looking at cutting out the weaker, older wood and the damaged wood. So you learn to recognize damaged wood and wood with not as much vigor compared to good wood. And you look to leave the good wood. We call it prune the weak wood hard, prune the weak wood all the way back. This is a Jackman clematis, one of the clematis with the purple flowers about 4 inches across. It's not one of the large flowered hybrids of Jackman, it's Jackman. So they're slightly smaller flowers than you're used to. And it's in the group of clematis that bloom on new wood as well as old wood. So for maximum bloom on this plant, we leave some old wood that grew the year before, as well as leave buds to grow up here and down at the base, new wood that will bloom a little later than what we leave behind. But you're looking at before on the left and after the cut. And at the base of the plant, that works out to the oldest branches get cut out every year. And I trace that branch back after I make the clip at the bottom. I trace that branch upwards and clip it away, which often means clipping side branches that are holding them together. I clip them away from each other and take out the top of the plant. So I've taken this out from the base. It amounts to that much was then taken out from the top. And that gets you great bloom on the large flowered clematis like Jackman and its hybrids like Henry I. And it's funny that the names are out of my head right now. Henry I is one of them. There are tons of them, Ramona and anyway, large flowered hybrids. Another example of pruning where apical dominance makes a difference is these crazy shrub type low roses. These are the knockout roses in this case, but there are lots of them, these ground cover roses. People just shear the tops and leaving the buds at the tip to grow. They get all this growth up here and it's just a tangle of thorny mess. It becomes impossible to reach into weed, to take debris out from the middle of the plant. It's just insanity. And yet if we cut them back to leave buds down here on the base, they will grow back and do this every year. So this one hasn't been cut for about 2 years. It has old growth back here. It's like a thicker, grayer branch. But what I do to those every year is this. I cut almost everything all the way down and leave just some of the most vigorous, thickest wood to come up so that it's not such an insanity for us every year. On climbing roses, it's a little bit different. Climbing roses bloom, most of them, only on the old wood. And what produces the flowers on the old wood are the side branches that grow off of the old wood. So this old wood in 1 year grew this side branch, which laid out and held its flowers out for you to see. I need then to keep some old wood on the climbing roses, some canes, and let them grow every year. So we start out looking like this, and you might look at it and I can understand it. And you go, I don't know where to start. You start with looking at the canes and saying, I see a couple of canes here that are younger, 1 and 2 year old canes. They're within the obelisk, good for me to work with. And this one, which is in its second year, it's already bloomed in the year before I'm pruning it from these side branches. That's flexible enough, I can work with that. So I'm going to cut all of these back and leave it like so. So now I've got that heavier cane pushed back into the obelisk and spun around. In addition, I have done this to the canes. I've bent them so that they're growing at less than a vertical angle. They're going to get more side branches if more of the buds, once it begins growth and once the apical dominance sorts itself out for the year, those buds are going to, if they're horizontal, grow more evenly with each other rather than the ones at the tip growing most. If you cut them bring them down at an angle, because then they are closer to the same level, all of them. It's less clear which one is dominant. So I've not only cut them back and left just good canes, I've also turned some of them, trained them to horizontal. And then we do that every year. This is a dwarf, or in this case, miniature climbing rose. You can see that doesn't mean that it's little. It means that the leaves are smaller and the flowers are smaller. And overall, the plant is a bit smaller than a big climbing rose could be. On lilac, this is the old-fashioned kind of lilac. We're trying to keep it is a bathroom window that it's by, so it's a good privacy screen. But we don't want it to keep all the light out, and we don't want it to grow up over the top of the house. So when we took it over, we looked and said, oh, there's a lot of old wood in there. We're going to take out, to start with, some old trunks, and we're going to take them out all the way down to the ground because this is suckering viciously from the base, and even some of the trunks have very dense clusters of little branches coming. We're going to take some of that old wood out because that old wood, once it gets to be bigger than about the size of a pool cue, it becomes big enough to support lilac borers. Lilac borer is a moth. It's a clear-wing moth, so it doesn't quite look like the moths you might be used to. But it lays its eggs on damaged wood on a lilac. See the damage down here? Every year the moth is going to come in June sometime, and lay eggs there where there's damage. The young caterpillars, when they hatch out, are going to then chew their way in and eat cambium just below the bark as they grow until they get quite big and come out out of the wood the next spring. They come out and chew themselves a much bigger hole. And this is repeated damage. Eggs laid here for years, come out in another place, and that weakens the plant, the branch above, so that it begins branching from below that point, giving you that thicket look that might not be what you want and certainly not what we want. So after I took out the first branches, it bloomed well. Everything we left on it bloomed, but it's still too big. So then we come in and take it down further. So we've taken more old branches out here so that we're bringing it down to stay this level at the windowsill, not up at the roof line. The advantage of doing that with lilacs, and many of the professional growers, gardeners at botanical gardens who manage lilac collections are doing exactly the same thing in order to keep the flowers down at nose level rather than up there. So taking out old wood is not only taking old lilac, borer, or damaged wood out, but it's also then giving us new branches that grow for only 1 year's growth, 2 years growth. They'll grow for 4 years, 5 years, and then they'll be old enough that we'll take them out. So in that 5 years, they only reach to about 6 feet and keep the blooms in that level that we want them to grow at. There, I keep coming in the winter and taking branches out. Before on the left and after on the right. Sometimes in restricting a plant's growth, you get things that are already overgrown. And if it's just too big to start with, we tell people to start with this point right here first. Don't lose the forest for the trees. Don't waste time cutting something that really is not something you're going to be able to keep cut small. Maybe you just shouldn't have put something that big, or maybe your situation has changed and you don't want to do the kind of work that it takes to keep a viburnum or a lilac little. In that case, don't waste your time. Just take it out, because this is this. See that cute little guy right there? If at this point, when this dwarf weeping hemlock gets to that size, I begin cutting it, and every year or 2 years I keep it at that size, I can keep it that small. But if I let it get as big as it can get and try to bring it back, then that's insanity. It really is. It's doable. It almost always is, but it's just not what you want to do. This right here and next to it right there, those are two double file viburnums, and they are 2 stories tall, and they're gorgeous. They're also called wedding cake shrub. The branches grow very horizontally, and each branch has a double row, a double file of big white flowers on it in June, late May and June. It's just gorgeous when every branch is lined with those flowers. But to bring it back to a small size is possible. To keep it at a small size is a lot of work. So I recommended that maybe they don't do that here. I said, just why don't you plant something smaller? There are other double file viburnums that we're in charge of that we started out with them big, not quite this big in most cases, but big. And it took us 3-4 years to make them look acceptable down further. You might just not want to do that. We also tell people that if you're going to cut something back that's way overgrown, do these 2 things. Look up for what relief there might be to get more light to the plant, and look down for what impact it'll mean when you take it out. And that's written up for you here. Why do you look up? You look up because the plant you are cutting back hard is going to need light to grow back well, and more light to grow back densely, which is probably what you want. So you may need to thin above it if it's an understory plant take some branches out of a tree in order to open a temporary window. If you take a branch out, the tree's going to grow new branches back into that space. But for a year or so, you have more light getting in, and you might need to do that if you're going to cut back hard in the understory. Also, if you're cutting back something big, understory or not, look down so that you can anticipate the consequences of removing that large plant. If you do it in the fall, you might be exposing the plants under it to damage in the winter. If you do it in the summer, things may scorch. People say, what happened to my hostas? All the leaves are brown on the edges. What happened to my looking glass brunnera and my Jack Frost, they're all burned on the edges. That's from sudden exposure. The plant was not ready for that amount of light and heat. You'll also find, and this is the biggie for us, when people take big plants out, two places I can think of right now where clients removed large trees. In one case, despite the fact that their gardener was on her knees at the base of the tree saying, please don't take this tree out. But the trees were taken out, and now in those areas, we are spending an hour and a half more every month weeding, because in the shade you get less weeds and you get different kinds of weeds. So you think about those things before you cut it back hard. And then if you decide that you do want to make the big cut, if it's worth it, cut it back smaller than you want it to be. See, you're going to cut it back hard, smaller than needed, by at least a year's growth. So I might cut that dwarf lilac we were looking at, if it was way too big, all the way to the ground, because I want to have enough room for the plant to grow for a year before I start doing the cutting to it again. If I cut to the ground, and we talked about this in last week's webinar, cut it all the way to the ground. Don't leave a bunch of stubs. You're going to be going back and pruning again, and you don't want a clutter of stubs. Year by year, that becomes a nightmare to try to prune it. So here's a neighbor's shrub. Watch out if you live near. I've had people say, oh, I wish you lived next to me. Near me, you could tell me what to do. Watch out what you ask for. This is a neighbor who said, can you tell me what to do with this privet? They're just too big. I'm having trouble reaching them to cut them. I said, well, yeah, I can help you out. So here is before, and here is after. She wants them to just come to the window where she's been cutting, or actually just below where she's been cutting. So I've cut to a year below that. Actually, this is a golden hickory privet, so probably I should have cut it back further, but you really don't want to make Nikki hate you as a neighbor. And I've also thinned out some of the base to take some all the way back, because golden hickory privet can grow a lot in a year. There's 1 year's growth. That honey-colored wood, a lighter colored, that's 1 year's growth on the privet. This is a boxwood that was getting too big. Might not look it here in the dormant season when we're pruning it, but there's other plants all around it, and the boxwood is bigger than we want it to be, preventing the look into the pond that's behind it there. So I want it to be the size that I've drawn the blue line on the picture for you there. I want it to be that size. I'm going to cut it even shorter than that so that it can grow for a year's time before I cut it again. And if that makes you gasp, then you need to travel to England, Germany, Netherlands, Canada. Much of Eastern Canada does a lot of their pruning in the European style. Go there in April and March and look at their boxwood hedges that are so lush and green and wonderful. They will be brown because they're cutting things back hard. But look at this plant now the same year. So here we are. Look how it's filled in those inner places and is smaller. Well, you can't tell. It's hard to tell before and after when the before is gone. And this is now the end of the growth, time when we could bloom again. See the fall colchicum are blooming. We've got a lot of the garden cut down already. When you do this, it can be a little shocking. Prepare yourself for it. In this case, a couple live here, and we talked to her. She said, it kind of bugs me that we have to keep cutting them because we sit on the porch, and we don't want them in the way of being able to see. I said, so you really want them to be about this size? I said, and I can cut those for you so that you only do those once a year. Go for it. She said, cut it for me. So I did. So I'm cutting, I want it to be this level. I have to cut further than that in order to have lots of new growth from ground up to that level. So it means cutting a lot out of these, which I'm doing. You can see here the daffodils are emerging. I'm doing this in April. And I'm making cuts to the main wood. It's going to sprout like that bit has done down here and right over there. Because it's a yew, it can sprout even from brown wood. There was a question I saw here from Denise. There are plants that if I cut and leave brown stubs, they're not going to ever grow from that stub. And we'll get into those a little bit later. But yew will grow from bare wood. So I'm cutting it back all the way down, leaving the bits that are within this limit, but cutting everything else down. Now, while I'm doing this, the other half of the couple came home who had not been consulted and said, "What are you doing to my bushes?" I said, "Well, I've cut them for you, Jerry, but it's April. They're all in the bags now." That was in April. So there they are in April. Here they are in May. Sorry for jumping, but again, I'm a professional gardener. I wasn't there in April. Here's May the next year. See how they've filled in? And now they have room to grow all of that next year up to here before we start cutting them again. And I'm not putting in the subsequent year's growth. They're back up to that level and that we want them to be and fluffy and full, and we cut them once a year. They're due to be cut this week. I got to get out there and get those cut. Now, will it grow back? The big question that people ask. And in that case, you got to think about timing. Will it grow back? And you have to think about what I call the PJ facts: pines, junipers, firs, arborvitaes, cypress, and spruces. They're written for you here. First, about timing. If you're going to cut back really hard, probably the easiest season on the plant to make a really hard cut is very early spring, before bud break. It may have a slower response because you're asking it to grow from dormant buds, but that's the way that it goes. And you can also wait until right after it blooms if you really can't spare even a year's flowers. It's probably riskiest to cut back really hard when it's very hot in the summertime. And if you're cutting back hard, you're usually going to end up with less flower, but just for that year or the year after. And do watch out if you have a grafted plant, like a top grafted PG hydrangea or a weeping cherry will have a graft at the top of a straight bit of trunk. And you don't want to cut the graft off or you'll get straight branches rather than weeping branches. So the leafless stubs: pine, juniper, fir, arborvitae, cypress, and spruce. And I make the spruce in the small s most times because spruce sometimes will grow from bare wood. So I'm looking here at a client's blue globe spruce. You can go to our website and you can search on the website blue globe spruce, and you will see these before and after. Right now, we're just looking at how much you can cut back one of those PJ facts and still get growth. So she would like to reclaim the patio. So I'm looking inside the plant to see, can I cut it back to beyond the line of the patio, to back into the bed? And when I look inside, I can say just at the edge here, I do have some green. So I can cut it back to there. And I did. I can't cut it back way back to here. If I left those stubs, I'd have nothing. If I take this branch out further than right about here, I'm going to have to take the whole branch out. And in the case of this juniper, I will show you the before and after on this juniper right now. Sue said, "I'd like more color in the front of the house." And we said, "Well, really, you need less stuff in front of the house. Can we prune the bushes back?" And she said, "Yeah." It's a mugo pine, a Chinese juniper, weeping Norway spruce. I'm going to check to see how far back I can cut the juniper. And you'll see that the growing tip, see the green tip right there, is outside the bed. So I can't cut this branch and have it do anything other than grow back onto the sidewalk. So this branch has to come all the way back. Now, when I get done pruning back everything all the way back, I look and say, well, I can keep going and clean out the dead wood in here and leave it up there. But I can also do this. I can take out several of these and leave one trunk as a tree, all of whose branches are within the line. In time, given it time, these side branches and these side branches will fill out and it will come down to the ground, but it won't ever be quite as wide as it was before. Here's an arborvitae that I'm cutting back. Actually, here's an arborvitae that I cut back because it was too big, and this is now grown back the next year. I was quite pleased with it. I said, wow, I cut that back by 3 feet, and look at how nicely it's coming back. But at that point, the client said, it's still too big. So I had to cut it again and let it grow back in, and now it's this size. Almost anything's possible if you're paying attention to how it grows. So this is one of those PJ Facts, an ARB. So I can't leave bare wood. I have to make each of my cuts to a place where there is a side branch with green on it. And that's what will take off and grow. You know, this stub right here has this growing on it, and it actually has little tiny greens like this one does coming out the other side. So I'm looking at that and saying, good, I can cut this branch all the way down to here. Step back and look at it. There it is. So I've cut this one back to the inside and said, grow, you guys, grow. These side branches don't have any of those breaks on them, breaks being new growth coming. So those branches are ultimately going to end up getting cut out, but I'm going to let it grow from here for a bit. So here, after I cut the side branches back, there's that tip, and that's going to be the top of what will be a rounded pyramid. And those buds, even the little tiny ones, will grow. See that right there and right there? You can see them much better in real life, and if you're not looking at Janet's camera work. Too bad Steve wasn't with me this day. But that will still grow because it's green. So you can cut back to there. After the cut, what do you do when you're cutting back something hard? Pay attention. Don't let the plant just try to get by on its own. Wait for new growth. And then you can start pruning again. And that's why we want you to prune it back for a year so you can let it grow for a bit and restore its energy. While it's growing back, make sure it's not got any undue stress. If it's desert-like conditions out there, keep it watered. If it happens to be really windy, you might throw some branches in the way to keep it from getting windburn on its new leaves. You're not going to get growth right away from it. The dormant buds, those little tiny ones I was just pointing at, or the invisible ones on a plant that is not a PJ Fax, the little ones that you can't even see on the branch, they're going to take several weeks to develop after other plants of the species start growing. So you watch plants that are the same kind as your burning bush or your yew or your honeysuckle that you just cut back hard. Watch them. When they have that nice flush of new growth, yours should bud out within about a few weeks afterwards. So in April, we cut this yew back to, like the picture you saw of Jerry's and Lisa's and Teresa's bush, we cut it back so there was no green on it, or almost none. There were a couple of tiny little bits. This is the 1st of June. It didn't leaf out when other yews turned green, but then it pushed out all of this new growth. At the same time in April that we cut it all the way down, we cut its buddy over here half down and left half up as an experiment, because we can experiment here at a mother-in-law's house. I said, Mom, we're going to cut them down for you so they're not over the walk. See the stain on the walk where they were. But we're just going to cut this one on the other side by half, because many of the English books say if you're going to cut a hedge back hard, cut half of it first and cut the other side the next year. I said, well, let's see what happens. And as far as we could tell, this one grew back more densely than that one. maybe because this part was shading it for part of the day, or also because this part had kept all its tips, which were dominant and were going to grow like 60. But at any rate, in June, after experiment done, we cut the rest of that back. Said, okay, we've got to figure it out. So now we cut this part back. And there it is, coming back up. From those old branches on you and other plants that sprout from dormant buds, this is the look that you'll get after they push new growth. If you see this, you say, good. And you don't say, oh, I don't have any growth out here. They're mostly going to come back close in. That's why you cut them back hard. And these are each going to be a branch like this. You can eventually take that branch out because this one's going to take off. If it doesn't come back that heavily, you might say, I give it up. And that's in the case of the shrub that I showed you to begin with. In 2012, it looked like that. I thinned it out and let light get in there. And in 2013, it looks like that. And I can cut out some more branches so that 2 years later, we've got another pyramid again. And I should update this and show you to you right now. It's just a gorgeous plant. Here's a Weigelia. There was a question here from Terry about cutting Weigelia back. It's pretty much like lilac, except the Weigelia also blooms twice a year. And so you like to have lots of new growth coming to be the second flush of bloom. This Weigelia, though, was at my new house. 3 years ago, we moved. The first thing when I saw this next to the garage in this ridiculously small space for any kind of shrub, let alone a Weigelia, I said, well, that's got to go. But we moved in late October, November, and it just wasn't time to do anything with this plant right away. It's bungee corded up, by the way. All the branches are held together with cord. It was February before I got to it, and I cut it back. I just sawed it off, and this is May coming back. And this is the end of that growing season. I just didn't have the memory to remember to take a picture of it while it was green. It grew all the way out to here in 1 year, but I nipped those back in the middle of the year because they were already getting in the way of the garage again. I meant to actually take the plant all the way out, but I didn't. And now I'm a softie. I'm going to let it stay at this level. But see how much it grows in a year? And now every one of those branches is going to bloom early the next year. And the new stuff that grows up inside will grow later. So you get a double flush of bloom on this plant if you've got lots of new growth coming from the center. Keeping a plant more tightly sheared, in the case of this pom-pom juniper, means that I cut it every year. This is now in August. That's when I prune this one, after the buds are set for the year, before the next bud break. And this group is just on the August schedule. I cut it in August, and it looks pretty much like this until the next August when it begins to get shaggy. And I'm going to shear it and thin it. When I started taking care of this one, it had grown out too far already, and it is a juniper. It's one of the PJ Fax. And so it's one of the ones that I can't cut it back to the tiny that it used to be, but I can cut it back and keep encouraging little new growth. So every year I cut it back and thin it, and it looks like this, and then it greens up and it looks like that again by the end of the year. And if you maybe tell that you can see inside of it. And we're seeing maybe more brown than I like to see on this plant because we started big. But we started out with very few of these and now more of them. See that little bit of growth there? That's what I've been encouraging by thinning, is that way inside the plant on this PJ Fax juniper, there's that little bit of green that can still develop. And I've been cutting back and letting light in, so I've taken it from being just a hollow ball too big, been encouraging it to come back to here. And it's taken a few years, but it works. And it does take time. It's a heck of a cleanup job. As my husband and I remind people, you have one cutter in the tree and you have 2 to 3 ground people picking up. It's not the cutting that takes the time. It's the picking up all of this stuff that you sheared and then thinned. And that takes, for that particular plant, it takes about an hour and a half. Is it worth it? It's up to you. And what if it dies? So people say, will it grow back? And then they say, what if it dies? We consider that not a loss, but an opportunity and a job half done. If it dies, that might happen, especially if the plant's in poor health or if it's one of the PJ facts that can't grow from bare wood. But if it dies, it's good riddance to a plant that couldn't live by your rules. And all that you've lost is the time that you need to wait for new growth. You've got a plant half cut back already, and the branch is already taken out. Just take it out of there and grab another plant. As a great example of if it dies, this is a Perodia tree in Virginia's garden. Virginia was, at the time that this picture was taken, these pictures was taken, was 99, very active, out with us all the time. And she said, Janet, can we cut that back? I meant it to be an espalier at the kitchen window level. But the arborist didn't understand me, and instead of cutting it the way I wanted, he cut off all the branches. Can we? I said, well, sure, we can do it. We can make it an espalier. And Virginia asked, well, when should we do that? And I looked at her and said, you're the one who tells me I don't wait for green bananas anymore, and I can't be sure of next spring anymore. So we do things when we do things. That's the same way that I prune, Virginia. So there we are, June 28th. And I said, I'm cutting it back right now. What have we lost? We haven't lost anything except waiting to see how it responds and how it grows back. And here's 1 month and 2 days later. See the new growth coming and see the buds coming out? See them, dormant buds pushing out? So that by 1 month after that, well, not quite 1 month, 3 weeks later, look at all the new growth. Nice new branches to train an espalier, take the vine off and espalier those branches. And there it is by the end of the year. So go ahead and cut. Let it go. Whoops, sorry. I'm giving you some take-home notes. We wrote these up for you, Steve and I, of things you need to watch out for in the way of diseases, because we need to prevent the spread of diseases while we're pruning. You can look at these when you get home. If you have a birch, this is the problem that you're looking for, an insect that if you prune hard, you can stress the tree and then have more borer problems because you've stressed it and you get more borers. If you have a juniper, you may have Phomopsis tip blight. We're not today going to go into this. Catch us later when we talk about problem diagnosis in June. Or go to the internet, set your search engine to images, and put in juniper Phomopsis. Or put in oak wilt and look for images, and it will tell you what that looks like. If you have those problems on these plants, be careful when you prune to prune only in dry weather and to sterilize your pruners. This is Caryopteris. It has a problem with Eriophyt mites. You'll see distorted wood at the base when you cut it back. Or canker, where the bark begins to dry, die, and lift off and crack. And canker sometimes follows things like a buck rub that damages the wood and lets a fungus in, and then a canker develops. If you have disease, clean your tools with a antimicrobial. Bleach and water, add a 10% solution, so 1 part bleach, 9 parts water, or rubbing alcohol straight out of the bottle, or peroxide straight out of the bottle. Those are already mixed up. Bleach is cheaper. I use bleach because I mix it up with water and I get more cleansing fluid than I would otherwise. This is juniper, hawthorn, rust. On the juniper, where it lives in the winter, it lives and then in the spring develops this glob that sends out spores that land on the leaves, and the rust lives that winter on a hawthorn, or in the case of juniper, of cedar, apple rust on an apple tree, and creates this problem in the summer. And the spores float back and do this back and forth. The damage on the juniper branch looks like this, and we need to cut out the damaged part and sterilize our pruners before we go cutting other junipers. This is crown gall. Crown gall, the other day I couldn't remember the name. Agrobacterium, great name. It's on a euonymus where most people are likely to see it. Looks like a tumor. But crown gall is something it's a bacterial infection that on the blade of your pruners could then infect forsythia, rose, euonymus, like burning bush, any number of other plants. Here's a rose that was pruned after pruning a euonymus and not cleaning your pruners. When that rose was pruned back hard, the gall then began growing in that part of the rose and ultimately made that rose not worth keeping. Here's time to take a breath and look at some pretty pictures, because we're going to go on to perennials and cutting them back. Perennials. Start with the fact that people say, oh, these perennials, they're all over the place. It's not their fault. It's just in their nature to grow and spread. And you don't want to tackle that kind of stuff at this time of year when everything's full, or this time of the year that you're seeing here in the picture. These hostas have gotten too full. They need to be reined in, but don't do it when they're actively growing. Do it when they're in the springtime right now. The younger they are, the more vigor they have. So on average, most perennials need every 4 to 5 years in order to be vigorous and healthy and keep the size down, the spread down. Keeps them from getting ungainly, and sometimes they get dead in the middle and flop outward. So we divide to keep them looking nicer. This is a division of this plant. This is the mother plant, Violet Queen bee balm, Monarda didyma violet queen, wonderful disease-resistant bee balm. I took one small section of it, dug it out, and moved it uphill. This is the next year. Look at how much taller it is. It's blooming longer. Go from here to the next month. It keeps its leaves. It's not a disease problem down here. It's just so crowded down here. So you want to divide more often if you can to keep the plant more vigorous. Center dies out in daisies. There was a daisy here. Then it had daughter plants. That next year, those daughter plants had daughter plants. And about that time, the center got crowded out and was also the place where the disease had the diseases that can get into these plants. All plants get diseases. All people get diseases. Just it got weak and it said, I'm out of here. So you get that dead center. When you divide, so here is the center, here's the daughter plant. See, it was growing out from there. That older plant has more problems. See the dark areas? Some of those things that infect plants have infected this one. It's not going to kill it. It's still going to bloom, but it's not going to be growing as well as the one that has less of that on the roots and the crown. And look how many more roots the daughter plant was able to grow because it was growing out into soil that hadn't yet been claimed by other roots. So you want to keep the vigorous outside portions of a perennial when you are dividing, rather than the inside, older portions. It's good pest control dividing. It keeps in check things like root insects, fungal diseases, bacterial diseases. This is monkshood blooming, but also monkshood dying. See the brown on the leaves? And actually whole stems are dying. This is a problem that the plant has the whole year. When the leaves come up in May, they are already deformed. See the curled and scorched edges? And if you flip over the underside, you can see the pustules on it. That leaf is infected because the base of the plant has gotten infected over the years. So that by the time it's blooming in that first picture, it has stems that are dying back on the inside because the infection has gotten on the leaves when they grew and has infected the stems and is descending the stem into the roots, so that even the roots are infected. That's the tuber at the base. And when the new growth comes from the eyes on the tuber, it's coming right past spores that it picks up, and it's already infected. That same plant has some newer growth that's not infected. You don't necessarily cut its roots open. I've done this to show you this. So I'm going to get rid of, when I divide it, old sections and keep only young, new sections when I put it back in. Iris, you divide frequently because they grow like crazy, but also because when I've divided it, I press on this part and find that it's soft because there is an iris borer in it. And the iris borer itself doesn't eat that much of the iris, but it carries with it the spores of a bacterial rot that make your iris go soft and gooey and smelly. It's disgusting. When you divide an iris, you're dividing quite often in July when all of the borers in the entire world are inside the roots. You're dividing and getting rid of those, and you're cutting down the number of borers that you're going to have in the next year. When you divide Black-Eyed Susan, you're looking at the spots on the leaves there. See them? That's the disease, that septoria leaf spot, that Rudbeckias get, and we need to keep under control by getting rid of the oldest parts of the plant and all parts that show any of that on it to keep it healthy. When you divide, now is great. When the soil is warm and the air is cooler than the soil, and before they get into rapid growth, right before a growth spurt, spring or fall when the soil is warmer than the air, because roots are then growing and the top is not growing so much. And it's okay if you want to go by bloom season. You can say, well, I'll divide my fall bloomers in the spring, and I'll divide my spring bloomers in the fall. It really doesn't make a difference. You can divide anytime you need to. You might need to shade things or stake them up after you do it, but divide them whenever you can divide them. There's always too much to do in a perennial garden. So spring is a real good time to divide. I've finished cutting down this garden and weeding it in the springtime, and now I'm going to get ready to divide things. Or in the fall, great times. Because this is what's happening. When the ground is warmer than the air, roots, these are brand new roots. These are not last year's crocosmia roots. That's what this little bit of growth that's just coming up in the spring, that's driving all of this root growth. So if you get those plants out of the ground at this time of year or in the fall and put them back in, they immediately just take hold in the soil. Here's all the new, that's all new roots growing on this platycodon balloon flower. Great time to divide it. It's a tap-rooted plant, so you're actually just cutting right through and taking any part that has a root and an eye, and that's a new division. Yes, you can take them in bloom. You can divide crocuses when they're in bloom. They're just, most of the time, people don't like to disturb their pretty pictures, but there's only so much time in the calendar and only so much time that an individual person has. Do it when you can get to it. On average, that's going to be every 4 or 5 years. And here's a whole list of examples of every 4 or 5 years, try to get to those. And you get to them because at Shirley and Steve's house here, we put in this miscanthus when this tree was little. The idea was that this would be a tall plant quickly, and then they could take it out. Well, they did. They liked it, and they'd leave it there. And now it gets so big in 4 years' time that it starts becoming very difficult to get out of the ground without damaging everything else in the area, and you're back in the bargain. For big plants, that's one miscanthus that I'm lifting up to put into the trunk there. We bungee corded it and then cut it down because that's the easiest way to handle it. But they're big. Get them before they get bigger than that. Things that grow very fast, we divide every 2 or 3 years. Here's a list: daisies, mums, tall phlox, coreopsis. They all grow very fast, so every 2 or 3 years they can benefit from getting divided. And by asters, we mean things like New England aster, that one right there. phlox, not only because it grows fast, but because this mildew problem, and this is mildew that was able to live in the plant long enough to become white spores. Mildew also looks like just brown leaves if it kills the leaf before it can sporulate. If I keep the phlox thinned down to where it's only 3 or 4 stems per clump, it's wide, it's full, it's beautiful, it's blooming great, but there's lots of room for the air to move through and dry these branches out so they don't get like this. If it's a really long-lived plant, we divide it when we need to divide it. They're not untouchable. Infrequently or not at all are things like gas plant and peonies and bleeding heart. It means that you can leave it in the ground a long time, but it doesn't mean you have to leave it in the ground a long time. A lot of these have the reputation of, well, don't disturb that plant. And people tend to think that means don't ever do anything to it. Wrong. If it gets big, divide it. If you want more of it, divide it. Hibiscus. That's one hibiscus growing in the background there. The ones with the great big flowers in late summer. And this is the hibiscus root. I've dug this one up. I just dug this up 2 days ago. And I dug it up because I thought I had to put it into a moister place. It was not growing as well as I expect hibiscus to grow. But when I dug it up, I found that it had this. See this root right here? Coming around. And this root right here. They're wrapping right around the rest of the roots. That's the pot that it was in. And because this is a long-lived plant, that root can't move itself. It's going to keep strangling the plant. I've cut them out, and now here's the crown of the plant that should have been able to expand, was being kept from expanding. So I'm not going to divide it. I put it back in the ground, but I could divide it. I could take a saw and just saw right down through here, just like you saw the section of that balloon flower a minute ago. And as long as I've got buds, they're at the base of last year's stem, and roots, I've got 2 plants. I could cut here, I can cut here, I can cut any place where I would get a top and roots, but I'm not going to. I put that one back in the ground. Hellebores have the reputation of being long-lived, and yeah, leave them in place, but you can also get new hellebores, beautiful foliage on hellebores. Butterfly bush, they can be divided too. It's a woody plant. You have to kind of saw it apart at the base, but they can live for a long time, or you can dig them up and move them around. That's a hummingbird hawk moth that's coming to the butterfly bush. How do you divide? Read the roots. There are runners that run on the surface or below the surface. There are tap roots, there are offsets, and there are woody shoot roots. And all you need to know is look at that. There's some examples of what runs on the surface, what runs below the surface, things that have tap roots. I showed you balloon flower a minute ago. Offsets and woody. Let me show you those. So here's a tap root. Here's that balloon flower that I showed you earlier with tap roots on it. Running roots, runners that run on and near the surface. See that runner coming off to the side and bringing a new plant up. Runners that run deeper. This one runs and the runner is coming off the root, and then coming up there. Offsets are like the daisy that I showed you earlier, where the mother plant sets a plant just to one side of itself, right at its base. Offset, like a hosta, doesn't spread so wide, but it's an offset right next to itself. And then there are woody roots like the butterfly bush and the hibiscus that generally have to be cut apart. So depending on what plant you dig up, look at its roots. There's only 4 or 5 ways to divide things. Runners, like toad lily, it's toad lily. You just dig up the plant and pull them apart. Every bit that's got roots and top on it will grow. Here's a runner. Now this is a weed runner, but it does the same thing. See, it's running. There it is. And making new shoots along the way. So every bit of that grows, and that's what happens when people try to rein in a plant and they didn't realize it was a runner. They leave pieces in the ground and it comes right back up again. Many of our runner weeds are like this. This is sow thistle running. Here's the plant in the ground, and there's its root that ran to the side and came up with a new plant. There's a runner ostrich fern and another one ready to come right there. Here's a runner deeper in the ground Japanese anemone. The root grows over to the side and then sprouts up. And generally that happens on those deep runners out at the drip line of the mother plant. As soon as the runner gets out of the shade of the mother plant and it feels warmer soil, that's where it turns up. If I want to control that plant, and a lot of people do want to control Japanese anemone, I need to remember that every year in the spring, I should cut around the plant, because they live a long time. Cut around the plant, reach down, feel for those runners, and pull them out, because those are going to come up that year. Tap-rooted plants, we slice down as long as you've got part of the root with eyes, see the eyes? And part of the root, you have another plant. Offsets, like this deer-bitten purple coneflower. Here's an offset. So right to the side, it's set a new plant, which is now growing roots off there and going to grow up the next year. So this whole thing is an offset of that. And these are offsets of each other, and they can all be pulled apart or cut apart from each other. Daylilies are offsets. There's a plant and its roots, and it's set off to the side and made another piece right next to itself. Grasses grow as offsets. They're very tight clumps, but they're offsets. Woody plants, this is an armeria. It's actually a little bitty evergreen shrub. We've divided and put back in little pieces. And we know it needs to be divided when it starts getting to where it's got some brown, the center is beginning to get dead. See, the center's dying out, getting too crowded. You can do this right from the get-go. You get one plant for $10, knowing that it's a woody crown because you either rinsed off the soil and looked at the new plant, or you've looked at one in your garden. You slice right down through the center. See that wood that I've cut right through? Just like you cut through the center of, I've forgotten that I put this one in there. This is real close up of that armeria. These are those little tiny grass-like leaves. So that $10 plant becomes 4 $2.50 plants. Put in the ground, along with a piece of the original plant. We've got pink and white now. There they are 3 months later. There they are the next year, further in the summer than in the next year. Now the third year in the spring and in the summer. So divide them, they fill back in. So read the roots and use good tools. You need a spade or a fork, preferably 2 forks. A hose and a bucket are your big things, and maybe a knife. The horticulturalist at this botanical garden was dividing her grasses by swinging an axe into them and then driving the axe through. It's a one-sided axe, hitting the back side of the axe with a mallet. You can also do this. Once the grasses or the perennials out of the ground, put 1 fork in, and do this on the lawn or something soft, because you need to put that fork all the way through the plant. Then take a second fork, drive it in next to it, and then push the handles apart. It will divide very, very much easier. And once you divide it once and get it into 2 sections, it becomes increasingly easier to get the others done. How do you divide? You cut so that you are in charge, and you look for eyes. Start at the drip line. If it's really enormous, you cut it like a pie. So this is Carolina lupin coming up and getting big, and I'm realizing that it's coming up to the little green here and here and here. I said, wait a minute. There's something coming up all through here. It's you're spreading out your underground runners. So I'm cutting, and all of that was right underground right there. I'm taking that out. All of it can become new plants because every one of those is going to grow. This is the lobelia that was growing next to that Carolina lupin. Here's its crown and all those nice white spring roots just growing. And here are the roots of the Carolina lupin growing right through it. I've got to lift this plant to take those out, and then I can divide the cardinal flower to much tighter offsets, divide it up and put it back in the ground. There's hosta, big hostas. There's 4 of them back here, but they are big clumps. They've been there 12 years. First, I cut them down. They're there, and they are. There's one there, one here, one here, one we can't quite see back over here. And to divide them, because they're big, I'm going to slice like that. One hosta is a pie. I'm going to slice it a piece of the pie out and lever it out of the plant in order to make it easier to get it out. And when I put it back in, I'm going to put in no more than 1/4 of what I took out. If I don't, by mathematical reasoning, this will become twice as big next year. If I put half the plant back in, by next year, the darn thing is as big as I just dug it out, and I don't want to dig it out that often. So water is really important to have. Rinse off the roots so that you can see those growing eyes I've been telling you about. Here's peony, which grows by an offset. Peony, offset right there. This is an offset I cut away from this part. And those are the eyes. Sometimes a year, those are hard to see unless you rinse it off. This is sitting in our sink. We just rinsed it off. Just get rid of the old part. Just get rid of it. And make clean cuts. You might want to dust with a fungicide or swish it in a little bit of bleach water. You don't have to, but if you think there are some diseases, you want to do that. If it's in bloom, you don't have to cut it back, and you shouldn't really cut it back. And you put it back in the ground. I usually throw them in a bucket, let them soak for a little bit. If I've got to hold them for a while, you put them in a cool place. Garage floors are really nice for that, where it's cool. And then put them back in where you level the soil and renew it, then put the plant back in and make the plant's roots spread wide at the same depth they were growing before. Water them in, and just make sure if it's out of season that they don't get blown over by the wind or knocked over by the mowing people. So you might want to stake it or windscreen if it's got big flowers sticking up on it. So when I put it back in, I make a wide hole and spread the roots wide. Make sure whenever you can that these roots that you spread trend down or horizontally. Don't put them in where they're turned up on the tips. That actually slows root growth to turn the tips up. Then you water them in. I dragged a little extra soil around each to make a little levee to hold the water in. And you've renewed the soil because you have things like this. These sedums needed to be divided. And you say, what's going on here? Well, that's where in the off season, the snow is piled off of the driveway and where the basketball tends to hit out here. So this is compacted soil. Before that goes back in, we need to loosen that soil because plants' roots are growing very deep into the ground. And when we compact it, it makes the roots grow shallow in the layer above the compaction, and the plant can't hold itself up as well or live as well in a drought. This is a problem of sedum growing in soil that's too wet and compacted, and so it's getting mildew, which tall sedum shouldn't get. By renewing, I mean we put lots of organic matter on the garden. Here's fall, I'm putting the old pumpkins on the garden and the neighbor's leaves. I put them in deep, see how deep they are. And every year by spring, all of those leaves are almost nearly broken down, and I leave them there and they finish breaking down. We're renewing the soil by putting back onto it organic matter to match all that we took out. So in this case, I took out, back here, the publisher didn't like this picture with the dirty wheelbarrow in, so we got this piece. We have half a wheelbarrow of daisies that I took out and I'm not going to put back in. So I put in a half a wheelbarrow of compost and leveled this area before I replant. I'm taking out golden marguerite and daylilies. I'm taking out that much. Tops and bottoms is 2 wheelbarrows, so I'm putting in 2 wheelbarrows of compost and then leveling it. And please, you've heard me say this before, but I have to put it in here. Do not put fabric on the landscape. This is one of the biggest mistakes in the world. These weeds are growing on the fabric, and meanwhile underneath, the soil gets starved because worms can't work up and down, grubs can't work up and down, microbes don't work as well between it. Just don't put fabric on the ground. So you have some take-home notes, the most frequently asked questions. Do you have to lift the whole plant? Do you have to worry about diseases and insects? Those are for you. You can read them. And you can download this material if you go to gardenatozee.org. And you'll see, if you click on About Us and where we're appearing, you'll see a page under where we're appearing that says that it is webinar handout material. Open that and you can click and download this and other handouts from our webinars. So go do it. Get your gumption up there and get out there and cut. And I thank you very much for your time and attention, and hope that you will be able to be with us on other webinars. We'll send you a survey as soon as you're done listening to this webinar, if you're listening live. You can download the outline from what we send you on a survey. But you'll have to wait for a live one. Right now, you must be listening to this recorded, since it is after the date. Go, walk about.